Hello and welcome back to another special edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project. It's a pleasure to have you with us today on Thursday, September 29th. It's also a great pleasure to be joined in the studio today by the two candidates who are running for the Bennington-Rutland 1 district in the November election. The Bennington-Rutland 1 district includes the towns of Danby, Dorset, Landgrove, Peru, and Mount Tabor. And we're really pleased to have with us today in the studio Michael Rice, who is running on the Democratic ticket, and William Gaiotti, who is running on the Republican side, hoping to win election to the state representative seat for that district in November. The current incumbent is Linda Joy Sullivan. She's represented the district for the past 3 terms since 2016, and one of these two gentlemen here will be serving the district up in Montpelier come next January. So just as a brief introduction, Mr. Rice is an organic farmer, lives in Dorset. He currently serves as the development director with the Northeast Organic Farming Association and has previously worked on farms throughout Vermont as operations coordinator with the local creamery and as research assistant with the Vermont Center for Agriculture and Food Systems. He earned a policy master's degree from the Vermont Law School and, as I said, lives in Dorset. Mr. Gaiotti is a resident of Mount Tabor and a Vermont native. He presently works on the grounds crew at the Dorset Field Club. He was previously the general manager of the Rutland Country Club, clubhouse manager at the Aquatic Country Club in Manchester, and head of security at the Green Mountain College in Pulteney before that school closed. And before that, he served for 12 years in the Rutland City Police Department, which he joined after graduating from Burn Seminary in 1988. I know that's an important distinction, so I wanted to make sure I got that one right. Well, again, gentlemen, thank you both for being here, making the time for this conversation, and giving the voters a chance to inform themselves about your positions and who they should cast their ballot for. I was going to say in November, but early voting is already underway, so if you don't want to wait, you don't have to. Anyway, to get our conversation started today, I thought we could each hear from both the candidates for 2-minute long opening statements. We did a little coin flip before we went on the air, and the winner of that was Mr. Rice. So, Mike, get us started.
Sure. Well, it's great to be here. Thanks for bringing us together. Andrew, it's good to be with you. Bill, I've really enjoyed getting to know you a little bit through the last few months, and I've really appreciated that we've been able to maintain good civil discourse during the campaign. I think that is missing from a lot of our politics in a lot of places right now. So thanks for being a part of that. My name is Mike Rice. I'm the Democratic nominee to represent Danby, Dorset, Landgrove, Peru, and Mount Tabor in the Vermont House. Despite family history that goes back about 8 generations here in southern Vermont, I grew up over the border in upstate New York. I first came to Vermont to work on a farm. And it was during that season on the farm where I got to see a number of different farmers of different generations, different backgrounds coming together to steward the land and feed their community. And it was that experience that led my partner Sean and I to decide that we wanted Vermont to be the place where we put down roots and stayed. And that was when we discovered that it can be a hard thing to do, either as a Vermont longtime resident or a new resident in Vermont. We've navigated the rental housing market. We've struggled to find job opportunities in our fields that paid what we needed them to. We've dealt with the reality of living without the protection of paid family medical leave. And we've witnessed how the changing climate globally can impact our communities here in Vermont. We've become a part of the fabric here. Sean went to work at J.K. Adams in Dorset. I got my policy master's degree at Vermont Law, joined the leadership team at NOFA, and we've had the great privilege of becoming first-time homeowners here. And now I'm seeking to represent these communities and go to fight for them in Montpelier. And I would be honored to have your support.
All right. Mr. Gaiotti.
Well, thank you again. Thank both of you for being here. I appreciate this opportunity. I have been here my entire life. I was born and raised here, started off in Manchester, and I've lived in the street that I live on for the last 40 years in 3 different houses, but all within sight of each other. It's all on a piece of land that my great-grandparents purchased in 1925, and I'm the 4th generation to still be on that property. As you mentioned, I wasn't going to say Burn Seminary, but that is where I went. It would now Burn Academy, of course, and from there I went to the Rutland City Police Department, where I served for 12 years. The best part of that time was when I was a canine handler, and that is where I met my wife, who I was introduced to by my father, and we met in 1988 and started officially seeing each other in 90 and got married in 1992. And then we had our 2 children in 96 and 97 and raised them in the house that I still live in now. And during that time, I was my kids weren't in school yet, and I was grousing about the school for some reason, and my sister said to me, what are you going to do about it? And I said, I don't know. What do you mean? She said, unless you're willing to get involved now, I don't want to hear you complaining when they're in school. So I took her advice, and I think at the time I was on the select board, and I also ran and got on the school board. So I ended up serving locally in the Mount Tabor board, and then the Courier Memorial, which is called the UD23 board, and off and on the BRSU, the Bennington Rutland Supervisory Union board, over the course of about 12 years. So after, I served those, and then I got into the coaching, and I became a coach and girls basketball coach, which I did for 13 years, all the way from 3rd grade at Courier up through to varsity in Burton, and then an AAU program that I coached, and my wife was the driver, bookkeeper, manager type. So we were fortunate to have had an opportunity to work with an amazing group of kids over the years, and unfortunately my wife lost her battle with ALS 2 years ago, and after that time I quit everything I was doing and stayed home with her, and after her passing, then I joined the field club, the grounds crew of the Dorset Field Club, and I've loved being outside most of the days. Not all of them, but anyway, all that being said, what leads me to run is what we're going to leave it into now, correct? So, like most people, I concentrated on my career and raising a family, and I left the politics to the people who were elected. As you're, forging your way through in younger ages, you don't really have the time to concentrate on those kind of things. And over the last several years, I've had some concerns on the direction that things are going in the state, and it's become more obvious to me that we've got out of balance. I'm opposed to extremes on both ends, and I think that the best laws and policies are made for everyone in the state of Vermont when both sides are at the table working together. And that's one of my concerns, looking at the numbers and what has prompted me to move forward.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you both. So let's unpack some of these issues and reasons why you both decided to throw your hat into the ring here in this election cycle. And Mike, let me go back to you here. I guess just to get us started here, if you are elected, what are some of the main issues or legislative priorities that you would like to work on as quickly as possible once you're up in Montpelier?
I got into the race because I really love the way that the state legislature in Vermont is so deeply rooted in the communities that the representatives serve. It's a small district, a few towns, and you really get to know what's on people's mind and what they're looking for from their legislature. So the things that I've been hearing over the course of the race, the biggest issue seems to be this interconnected series of crises that we face locally and in the state and across the country, which is a housing crisis, a child care crisis, and a workforce crisis. And the workforce piece is obviously incredibly related to the other two. You can't develop a workforce if folks can't afford to find a safe, quality place to live or have childcare to care for their children while they're out working. So those sort of interconnected pieces are certainly an area that I'd like to address as soon as I get to Montpelier. And then also another piece that's connected to all of it is our climate crisis. I think we see the big issues with the changing climate on a global scale, and we also see how those impact our communities with changing weather, changing the way that farmers can grow, the seasons in which they can grow, the pests and pressures they're dealing with. So that's another area I'd really like to tackle.
Okay, well, you mentioned a couple of issues here that were on the short list here as things to talk about and items to discuss. Bill, let me go over to you. Let's start with the housing question, since that clearly is one that's on everyone's mind. Everywhere I go, it seems that comes up as a subject. What do you think would be the best way we can build more housing for all levels, really, but particularly, I suppose, the affordable and middle range housing? That seems to be the area where there's a shortage of available housing for folks. Any thoughts come to mind as to what we could be doing differently than what we're doing now? Or is it a case where the state has made some fairly substantial investments in housing through some of the ARPA funds that have come through from the federal government? Is it maybe a case where we just wait a couple of years until that money starts to finally flow through the system and houses get built, and eventually that'll help to solve the problem?
Well, I'm not sure if that's going to help to solve a problem if we don't acknowledge that the regulations need to be reviewed, and that's a big issue for us moving forward with any housing. We just saw this in a article today or yesterday, where in West Windsor there was a development plan for tiny, I think they were tiny houses. They were fairly small, 500 square foot or so. A small development of small houses. It was approved by the town, and everyone was on board except the state of Vermont said you can't do this because of Act 250. A lot of these energy projects are exempted from some of these standards and the regulations in Act 250. We need to look at why we can't do the same for housing and start to get some of this entry-level houses created for people. And I know it's affecting everything. You have nurses, teachers, police. If you don't have somewhere, it's not obviously going to encourage people to come here. But we also need to encourage businesses and help grow the economy. It's as Carville said, it's the economy, stupid.
Any other thoughts on housing? What do you think should be done that's not being done now?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that there needs to be regulatory change and that Act 250 needs to be amended. I think Act 250 was an incredible piece of legislation that helped to make Vermont what it is today. But it's also half a century old, and legislation, regulation needs to be updated. The Democratic majorities in the legislature tried to update Act 250 this year, and the governor vetoed it. And so I think that what the Democrats were getting at was to amend Act 250 so that the kind of housing that we need can be built, but Vermont can still remain the place that we love. And so building more housing in densely populated village centers, city centers, town centers, and not building sprawl out into the rural areas outside of those centers. I think you're right that there's been a huge investment in housing, $375 million in the last few years. Some of that was obviously just to manage during COVID to keep people safe and housed during a pandemic. But some of it was to build more housing. And I think we will start to see that, trickle down as the next few years play out. I think that there are two levels of housing action, right? There's how do you fund programs that keep people housed, and there's how do you fund the construction of new housing. We need both. But I think, you mentioned this project in Windsor, and I think that's a good example of the best successes of housing projects start locally, take local buy-in, and have strong local leadership behind them. And then the state has to be able to support that local action, I think.
Okay.
Well, on the governor's veto, can you expand on that?
It was one of his record-setting vetoes.
He does have record-setting vetoes, and that should be a red flag to the voters in Vermont that we are not working, the sides aren't working together the way they need to be working. But if you have one side that has the majority control, as the Progressive Democratic Party does at this point in time, then there's no reason for them to come to the table and listen. And
there is reason, because the governor is a Republican, and they don't have a veto-proof majority. So
right.
What happens is the Democrats come to the table and they say, here's our ideas, we have all these problems, let's come together and find a solution. And the governor waits until the last moment and then says to many of them, no. And that's not governing either. That's not consensus building either.
Well, if they were bringing things right from the get-go that were a little more common sense and were going to be more beneficial all the way around, then maybe we wouldn't be having a record-setting vetoes. But
well, I think that reforming Act 250 to be able to increase our housing stock in our city and village centers sounds like common sense to me. I mean, and perhaps there were problems. I wasn't in the legislature at the time.
yeah,
so
neither was
I would hope
but
that-
even the mayor of Burlington was opposed to it, so there had to have been some more issues than that. But
Well, as we can see, this is a fascinating and multi-tiered issue here. But let's move on. Childcare is another big issue that gets mentioned frequently. Cost of childcare for many young families is takes a big chunk out of the weekly paycheck, and more economic sense for many folks for one parent to stay home and not work in order to look out of the kids, so they're not paying for childcare. I guess I just wondered what both of you think we should be doing, again, that we're not doing as a state. And well, Mike, I'll let you start on this one. Are there some solutions that you have thought about that might help alleviate our childcare situation?
Yeah, so you're right. It's a big chunk of a lot of people's income. About 25%, I think, on average, of parents of toddlers. 25% of their income goes out the door to pay for childcare. 3 and 5 at the same time. That's if they could find it, right? If they can find quality childcare available in their community. 3 out of 5 of Vermont's youngest kids don't have the care they need, don't have access to it. It's not available. And then you have early childhood educators who are paid barely above minimum wage. They can't afford to stay in the field. And so that, again, connects to the workforce crisis. If you have people constantly leaving their positions in childcare, talented, highly educated, dedicated people who just can't simply afford to make it work to stay in those positions. The legislature, I think, has done some good work, again, like they've done on housing over the last few years. They've raised some income caps, expanded eligibility so that more people can afford more child care than they could before. There, I think, have been some good ideas around loan repayments, scholarships for people going into the field to try to incentivize folks to work in childcare. But there is more to do. I think childcare is essential economic infrastructure. And without an investment in our childcare system, without fixing this broken childcare system, we're never going to start to tackle the other things that we've talked about and that we're going to talk about. That allow for thriving communities, allow for working people and families to come to Vermont and to stay in Vermont.
So you're suggesting then what the state needs to do is simply put more money into increasing the salaries of childcare workers, or?
I think increasing the salaries of childcare workers, but also we need something like 8,000 more spots just to fill the current need of the current generation of kids needing childcare and early childhood education. And yeah, it's going to take an investment from the state to lower the percentage of folks' income that they're having to put out the door to pay for childcare, while increasing the amount and quality of childcare available. But like I said, I think it's an investment that we can't afford not to make. Otherwise, we're going toward a place where we don't have communities where people can live and work and raise kids.
And Bill, what are your thoughts on that subject?
Well, here's another case in point where it's where's the money come from to do this? And I have friends. I was talking with one last night. He has a little girl, and he's fortunate to have an opportunity of flexibility in his schedule where when they don't have the care, the child care, for whatever reason, falls through, then he is able to adjust. But what they have to spend in a month was crazy money. I was surprised by it. But anyways, it's been a long time since I've had a child. But we can't solve all these problems by just continuously throwing money that we don't have at it. Instead, we need to open up business. We have to make this state more friendly, where we can encourage companies to want to come in here and do business and create jobs that can pay a wage that will get the person ahead, where they can pay for childcare and still put money away. Right now, that's not happening. The percentage that Mike quoted are pretty accurate. It's high, and Vermont ranks in the top for how much it costs for kids of all ranges. So again, it comes back to the economy and us having to be opening up and be more friendly towards bringing companies' business into the state.
But investing in childcare, I think, is inviting those businesses to the state. Because if you have a state where people can't afford to raise kids, or where there is no childcare available for communities all around the place where someone might be hoping to open a business, they're not coming here. They're going to places where those basic community services are available.
Well, I would disagree with that they're not coming here because of the child care situation. I'd say they're not coming here because we have had a history, especially in the last 20 years or so, of not wanting to build a business in the state. They have to jump through so many hoops, and the red tape. I know a small business owner who lives locally, but they are able to run their business out of state and would love to bring it here, but there's no incentive for them to do that. And we need to look at those things. We really need to. We have a situation where the number of nonprofits is out of whack with the number of for-profit businesses. And those for-profit businesses are the ones that are paying the taxes that are going to help pay for all of these programs that everybody thinks they want in this state.
All right. Well, we've got a long list of subjects to get through here, so let me proceed along here. Law enforcement is another subject that keeps coming up repeatedly in in all kinds of ways, basically, and has for a while. It's not a new issue. We've heard calls to defund the police. We've heard calls to restructure the police. And Bill, I guess since you have a bit of a law enforcement background here, let me throw this one to you first. What do you think ought to happen in terms of law enforcement? I mean, we're looking at a lot of vacancies in many local, city, and town police departments. In the state police, my understanding is there's somewhere between 60 and 70 positions that are currently not being filled by officers that they'd like to have. What do you think we should be doing in terms of policing and law enforcement, again, that is not happening at the moment?
Well, we have to change the narrative. We have to stop this movement that has occurred over the last couple of years of discrediting and defunding police. Unfortunately, Vermont almost wanted to be in the limelight. They took bad situations that happened in other places and wanted to apply them here. It's pretty tough every day to get up and go to work when you don't think that people are respecting you or have your back. And the move in this last legislative session to do away with qualified immunity for our law enforcement officers, it was just a blatant attack on the people who get up every day and go out and serve our communities. That has to be reversed. That cannot continue to move forward. We are losing, as you just mentioned, the numbers are at an all-time low. People are retiring much a higher rate than are actually coming into work here. And it's one of those things you can't throw money at. The majority of police officers, and I say this about teachers and nurses, everybody that's in those kind of fields, they're not doing it to be millionaires. I mean, they know going in they're not going to be making millions of dollars doing this. They go into these fields to do good, and they need to be respected, and they need to know that the people support them in every one of those fields, not just in law enforcement. The shift, everyone's become so brave with social media, and it's really changed, unfortunately, the way we conduct ourselves. And we need to really step back and take a good hard look. I mean, the statistics bear out that we're in some tough times here in this state. And the first thing that you lose is the presence. And that is the first line of the ladder of force in law enforcement or anything. If you're sitting there doing something at your office and you're maybe doodling and your boss walks in, well, what do? You start doing your job, right? It's presence. So when we don't have enough police to have that police presence all around our communities, and it comes right to starting with driving down the road. If you've been on the roads here in Vermont, the speed limit just doesn't even exist right now. Cars are going up and down Route 7 or Route 30 at crazy speeds, and they don't have that. That police car isn't sitting there. And the first thing what you do when you see a police car, you slow down. So we're in a tight spot, and we need to first off make sure that this qualified immunity does removing that. And if they're going to remove it from law enforcement, then it should be removed from everyone in the state of Vermont.
And just to be clear, qualified immunity refers to a doctrine where police officers, in this case, can be sued for civil offenses.
Mm-hmm. And they still can be with qualified immunity, but it's a higher level. There's more protection for a police officer going to work every day with qualified immunity. And otherwise, without it, they could be liable personally for up to what, say, $25,000. Well, that's not a real incentive to get up and get going every day.
All right, Mike, what are your thoughts on the whole law enforcement subject?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, we need to look seriously at the way that we expend resources in the law enforcement. And that's not, I think that defund the police has become sort of a red herring in our political discourse over the last few years. But I think that, in talking about record numbers of law enforcement officers retiring and not being replaced, numbers being lower than they have in years past, I think a big part of what we can be looking at is what are we asking law enforcement officers to do that could be someone else's responsibility, someone else's job in our community. So for instance, in dealing with nonviolent offenders, in dealing with people facing mental health crisis, in dealing with people dealing with addiction or substance use disorder, in dealing with people experiencing homelessness, is there another option where we could be shifting resources to something that can better serve the community and taking that burden off of law enforcement officers so that they can focus on the jobs that we all need them to do and that they are there to do. So that's, I think, a more nuanced part of the discussion about resources in law enforcement, right? In terms of qualified immunity, again, I haven't been in the legislature. I wasn't there for those discussions and debates in Vermont over it. What I think is that it is a problem if someone can, what qualified immunity protects all government servants, and in this case, the focus is on law enforcement. It protects them from being held liable for violating someone else's constitutional rights. And so I just think that we need to get to a place where, and perhaps this has to do with training and education, and it has to do with, again, taking burden off of law enforcement officers so there's not that unfair level of responsibility. But I think that we do have to make sure that we live in a society in which no one can violate the constitutionally protected rights of another person and not, be held accountable in some way.
Well, I don't think that's totally accurate. If there's a whole line of that they have to meet in order to get the qualified immunity, and specifically violating someone's constitutional rights does not qualify. You won't get qualified immunity if you're proven to have knowingly violated someone's constitutional rights.
Again.
So that's not. I mean, that's just not accurate. But so
I do believe there have been instances.
Well,
this is why this is a conversation that's being had in state legislatures all over the country and elsewhere, where there are people who believe their constitutional rights have been violated, and the law enforcement officers who violated them are not being held accountable because they.
Well, that's a narrative that's being put out there, but I think if you look into it, you'll find that that's not accurate. But on top of that, we have another big issue all around in Rutland, Bennington, bigger areas, where, and some of this is a result of the pandemic, where the courts have been shut down and people are not being prosecuted. Victims are not getting any justice, and in a lot of cases, the perpetrator gets portrayed as a victim, and we need to, and this is going to go right into the opioid crisis, and that is certainly a crisis. The number of people dying annually in Vermont and nationwide is just staggering. And I just don't understand why. I think too much time is spent on issues that are not anywhere near the magnitude of what's happening with the opioid crisis in the state. And I think we really need to concentrate way more on that. And that would include, right now, we've opened the state up. It's just open for business for heroin and fentanyl sales. And going back to the backlog in our criminal justice system, these guys know what's going on here. We've made it a very welcoming state for them to come and make money, and the risks aren't great. I mean, it's the rewards are well worth the risk right now, and that needs to be changed. We have to start with arresting the people who are actually bringing this stuff in. Let's start there, and hopefully we can do some prevention and get the people who are addicted the help that they need.
You want to comment on that opioid crisis?
Sure, yeah,
That was
well,
one of our other points we were going to talk about later, but let's jump down to that now.
Sorry about that.
While
Yeah.
we're here. That's okay.
No, I mean, I'll start by saying I absolutely agree, with what you transitioned out of there, which was the court backlogs. I think, that is obviously partially stems from COVID, but I think it was a problem before COVID, and certainly has lasted longer than a lot of other related problems. I think that, it again ties into workforce, right? It's about having the number of people necessary in the courts, in the courthouses, staffing those positions so that we can be moving in a fair and just way. And that does have to do with both victims and folks who have been arrested for crimes, because obviously victims deserve a swift process. But in this country, people who are who are accused of a crime and are going through the process of toward possible conviction, they deserve that process to be swift, fair, just also.
Absolutely.
So I think we definitely agree that that's a problem that needs to be addressed. In terms of the opioid crisis, I mean, it's devastating. It's absolutely devastating, and it keeps getting worse. It keeps getting worse everywhere, but it keeps getting particularly worse in Vermont. Year over year, numbers of opioid-related overdose deaths are skyrocketing. And what that tells me is that what we're doing about it so far isn't working. I lean toward harm reduction. I lean toward making available, making things like Narcan and fentanyl test strips, things that can reduce harm for those who are dealing with addiction and substance use disorder as quickly as possible. Because that's what you do in an emergency, right? In a crisis, you try to get help to the people who need it as quickly as possible. I don't think it's a crisis that we're going to arrest our way out of. I think we need to deal with the underlying root causes of addiction, substance use disorder, mental health crisis, and the like.
Let me just ask a follow-up question around this to both of you. Would you favor seeing a safe injection site, not necessarily in your district, but maybe within easy driving range, maybe Rutland, Manchester, Bennington, some place where folks could go and be safe, get a safe injection? This has been discussed for possibly having one up in Burlington that has been shot down for the time being. But would that be a way to go that would at least begin to, bend the curve a little bit on some of these overdose deaths that we're seeing?
I think so. This is a healthcare issue, right? And I believe in listening to healthcare providers, to experts. And if they're saying that something like a safe injection site could be an important tool in their toolbox alongside many other things, then I think we should listen to them. And I think we should at least take the step of learning if it's something that could work, that could help us find our way out of this crisis.
Well, when you said not necessarily in your district, then yeah, that not in my backyard mentality would definitely take precedent here, because I can imagine that I can't imagine any location within the 5 towns in our district that we would be representing that would be in favor of that. And I'm, at this point, I would not be in favor of it either.
Okay. Let's, we're gonna have to get to a lightning round pretty quick here, I think. But one other major topic, which is gonna defy a lightning round sort of exchange, is the whole climate change question. Last year, the state legislature attempted to put through a clean heat standard to lower carbon emissions produced in the state. That failed by one vote to overturn the governor's veto. I guess I'm just wondering if either one of you is elected and the clean heat standard question returns, or something like it, or maybe a revised version of what didn't make it to the finish line during the last session, would you be in favor of something like that? Mike, I'll start with you on that one. Do you think that clean heat standard, as it emerged, was a good idea? Maybe needs some tweaking, maybe or maybe not? Or do we go in a different direction?
Yeah, I mean, I would have supported the clean heat standard, you know, as it was if I were there this year. There were things that I would have preferred to see it do differently. But I think, you know, a few things here. One is we don't have any time to waste with addressing the climate crisis. You know, we've been talking about taking action for just about my whole life, and we have delayed and put off and not done what we needed to do. And now we're in a situation where if we don't act swiftly and seriously, nothing else is really going to matter come down the road, right? So I think that what the clean heat standard did, and there's, I think, a lot of, you know, misinformation out there about it. I think that what it did at its core was allow people, if they wanted, to transition away from highly volatile, price volatile fossil fuels, as we've seen over the last year, into something that can heat their home for a less volatile price and help us meet our necessary goals on addressing the climate crisis. So I would support, you know, I don't know what it'll look like in the next session, but I'm in favor of taking real action to address climate and to help get people, you know, heating their home with things that are less volatile and less determined by factors that the state legislature has absolutely no control over, like global oil prices and things like that.
Yeah.
Well, at this point, I would not. I don't, and I'm not, there's no, you know, climate change. I'm not that guy, okay? But I'm also not that if we don't act, like right now in this legislative session, that we're all gonna burn tomorrow. There's some place in the middle that we have to meet, because and I'm all for, believe me, if I could heat my house for pennies on the dollar, man, I would be so happy. If I could drive to work and, you know, not have to put almost $5 a gallon gas in, that would be fantastic. But we have to take into consideration all the other factors, like all the unintended consequences when we pass legislation. And I've seen this, you know, for years with, you know, with like the school board, where there would be something, an unfunded mandate, and then the next thing you know, you're on the hook for something. And the people who are trying to figure out right now in this state, you know, where they're going to spend their money, how they're going to get to work, how they're going to heat, how they're going to pay for childcare, how are they going to pay for $10 a pound bacon. Those people, I'm sure everybody is concerned about the climate, but that's a real issue, what's happening to them right at this moment. And we have to really look at all of the factors. We have to look at all of the options and try to come up with a plan going forward that everybody will be on board with, and to reduce as much harm. You had mentioned harm reduction, and I would be curious as to your thoughts on nuclear power.
You know,
And the harm reduction part of that, just so you know, is you know, if 10 years ago, the legislature did everything they could to get Vermont Yankee shut down. Well, here we are, ironically, trying to figure out how we're going to have a power grid to be able to charge electric vehicles. And we got rid of one of the safest and cleanest sources of power. And it's been proven, there's plenty of reasons that, you know, in the 70s, it was the boogeyman. We had to stop, you know, the Sierra Club was totally against having all these power plants. And come to find out, it's one of the safest and cleanest powers that we can produce in this world.
it doesn't come without its problems or its risks.
Nothing does.
And I would say that not looking backwards, but looking forwards and dealing with the situation that we're in now, which is that we don't have a nuclear power plant online here in Vermont, and we need, you know, we're legally obligated by 2030 to meet our goals on climate. And so, you know, I would prefer to see us look toward trying to get more in-state renewable energy generation going, because I also think that it's a grid resiliency issue to be so reliant. You know, right now, we like to say that our energy is one of the clean, you know, percentage-wise is some of the cleanest in the country, but an enormous portion of that is imported from Hydro-Quebec. You know, I think there are a number of issues with that, not the least of which is that it does cause some potential for questions of the resiliency of our own grid if we're not generating the energy here in state. So,
But just to touch back on that, I can't imagine you're going to find anybody who, well, maybe there are, but the majority of people would agree that that's the direction that we need to go. But we need to, I mean, you know, Vermonters they're sensible. They know what's needed, and we all want clean air and fresh water. But we want a plan that makes sense to move forward with that. And that's where I think we maybe got the cart ahead of the horse here. And you said, you know, with the marketing part of it, well, it's not marketed well because it's not well thought out yet. And they need to work at making sure that they could come to us and say, here in the next 10 years, we're going to have this develop, this develop, this develop. And hopefully those jobs would be done within state. And then off we go. And then everybody's in a Tesla.
well, yeah. I mean, I guess I'm glad we don't disagree on the existence of climate change and the need to make progress. I guess we just disagree on the timeline. You know, I think you're absolutely right that we need to make this transition in a way that doesn't leave folks behind or have people, you know, unable to heat their home or drive to work. Of course, but you know, frankly, I think that the clean heat standard went a long way toward making progress in that direction, and unfortunately, it didn't make it past the finish line.
Let me just jump in here real quick. I think we have time for maybe one more question before we have to bring things to a close. And Mike, since you're in the farming business, I wanted to ask, what are your thoughts about farming and agriculture, and I guess maybe talk a little bit about dairy farming. Obviously, I want to hear both of you on this, but you have a bit of a background in this and organic farming. So, it's been well known that dairy industry in particular has been hard hit in recent years. Fewer and fewer dairy farms. I mean, it used to be an iconic industry here in the state, and said Vermont, and people thought about a pasture full of cows. But the entire farming industry itself, I suppose, is under some pressure too. Anything you think ought to be done legislatively in the very near future to change the status quo?
Yeah, I mean, I've worked in a lot of different areas of food and farm systems. I've worked on farms, on sort of diverse farms, on a dairy farm and creamery. Locally, I've worked waiting tables in restaurants. I've worked on the sort of value-added production side of it. So I've done a lot of that, and then in the research side more academically, and in grad school in food and ag policy. What I know from bits and pieces of all those experiences is that the food system is fundamentally broken. And I think we see that in a few examples over the last couple of years. We had COVID hit, and because we are so reliant on this massive, not very nimble food supply chain, one thing can go wrong and grocery store shelves are empty. Similarly, over the last year with the organic dairy farms, we're so reliant on just a few huge corporate milk producers that one of them, Danone, decides that they're pulling out of the Northeast, and suddenly dozens of farms all across the state are without their only source of income, with almost nowhere else to turn. And that's obviously a product of a long time coming in a system that's broken. I do believe, nothing is going to be a simple solution. No, there's no, I think, one bill I could go up to Montpelier and write to fix the food and farming system. But I believe generally in investing in local and regional food systems, because that is an investment in our farmers and jobs on farms. It's also an investment in keeping our food supply chain much, much more resilient than it has shown itself to be. And I think another piece of that has gotten some play in the legislature recently is to invest in the farm to institution area, so that big buyers, institutional buyers around the state, schools, colleges, hospitals, are making connections with farms in the state, with dairy producers in the state, and buying those products locally and regionally. Again, it supports the farms and it creates a much more resilient system.
Well, I'm at a bit of a disadvantage in this question. But, it's sad what we've seen, no doubt, and Vermont was, it was a sheep state originally, right? And then the dairy, and that got, obviously, as regulations changed, it became more difficult for a lot of the small farms, and off they went. But in the 40 years in Danby, in the town of Danby, I believe, had 19 dairy farms, and there's one left today. And it saddens me every time I see it. I wish I had a magic pill that could make that all stop and could make it lucrative for those guys to continue doing what they've loved to do. I had 18, I guess, at one point, head of beef cattle, and a menagerie of other critters running around. But it was my luck. I bought high and sold low. That's just I wasn't good at it. So, and if there was some way for us to save, not necessarily save the dairy farms, but the land, and still give them an opportunity to work the land with whatever animal's gonna, bring the amount of money that can keep them going, I would be supportive of that. But
Yeah, it's a very complicated situation.
it's difficult. But again, it comes back to, the economy. If we can get some business where people can make good money, they're going to be much more willing to pay for the organics. And I'd love to have everybody eating local and eating organic, and that would be ideal. But, a lot of families unfortunately end up in Walmart and do their shopping there. And it's just a matter of how much money they have in their wallet to spend.
All right, well, we're just about out of time, but I wanted to leave a minute or so for each of you just to make a closing statement. We can wrap things up, and let's see. Mike, you went first, so Bill, I guess we'll start
Yeah,
with
that
you
was
on the
me.
closing statement.
So, my life experiences here in Bennington and Rutland counties. I've been a student. I've been a public servant, supervisor, a tenant, a landlord, a coach, and a father. And they all give me perspectives that will really help me represent the people of our district in Montpelier. And I don't think that Montpelier is the place to go to learn about the district and the people here and what their needs are. That should be something that you've been a part of and learned before you ever get there. I'm proud to say that I have the endorsement of Governor Phil Scott and Walt Reed, who held this position for 12 years and was Speaker of the House, I believe, for 6 of those years. They're both moderate Republicans, well respected, both understand the need for compromise and working across the aisle and getting everybody to try to get what is best for everyone in the state of Vermont. And I would certainly appreciate your vote anytime from today to November 8th. Thank you.
All
Thank you,
right.
gentlemen.
Your turn, Mike.
Yeah, I'm running because I know what's at stake in this election. I know that when the voters in Danby and Dorset, Mount Tabor, Landgrove, and Peru make their choice for state representative, when their ballot arrives in their mailbox now or anytime through Election Day on the 8th, they will be sending someone to the legislature in January who will be working on a number of different things that we've touched on today. Solutions for our housing crisis, our child care crisis, our workforce crisis, for the opioid epidemic, for climate change and renewable energy production, on being sure we have safeguards in place to protect rights that we took for granted just a few months ago and are now under attack, like the right to choose. Having lived in this community over the past number of years, I've dealt with a lot of those issues firsthand. I have the lived experience of dealing with negotiating the rental housing market, becoming a first-time home buyer, lacking paid family and medical leave, trying to find opportunities for work with wages that can make it all work. And I think that this lived experience would help me bring a fresh perspective to the legislature and represent all members of the community in Bennington and Rutland County who I seek to represent. I'm proud to have the endorsement of the Planned Parenthood Action Committee, Vermont Conservation Voters, Sierra Club. Let's Grow Kids Action Network has called me a child care champion, and a number of other organizations working in our communities and around the state to make progress together. So I would be honored to have your support in this election, and I hope to go to work for you in Montpelier. And thank you both. I really appreciate it.
I want to thank William Gaiotti, Michael Rice. They are the Republican and Democratic candidates for the Bennington-Rutland 1 District, Danby, Dorset, Landgrove, Peru, and Mount Tabor. And folks, get out your vote and head for the polls. You can do it now if you want. Thanks again for being with us. We'll see you the next time.